The funeral home was quiet, almost eerily so. Soft light filtered through the tall windows, casting gentle shadows across the room. Family and friends filled the space, their faces lined with sorrow. The air was heavy with grief, as everyone tried to come to terms with the reality of what had just happened. In the center of it all, there was a single coffin, its polished wood reflecting the faint light. It seemed like everything had stopped for a moment, except for the soft murmurs of voices, the sound of footsteps shuffling, and the occasional sniffle. A young girl stood in front of the coffin. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her fingers trembling. She was still in shock, still trying to make sense of it all. How could he be gone? Just a few days ago, they had been laughing together, making memories. Her father had always been there for her, strong, caring, and full of life. And now, all of a sudden, he was gone. She glanced around at the mourners, but their faces blurred in her vision. She could barely hear their whispers, only the pounding of her heart in her ears. Her father, the man she had always turned to for comfort and advice, was no longer there. She could still see him so clearly in her mind, the way he smiled, the way he always knew exactly what to say to make her feel better. The thought that she would never see that smile again made her feel like a part of her was dying too. Slowly, she moved forward, her feet almost unwilling to carry her. She reached out a hand, trembling, and placed it gently on the edge of the coffin. Her fingers barely brushed the smooth wood, but it was enough to send a shiver through her. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather the courage to do what she knew she had to. She had to say goodbye. Her breath hitched as she stepped closer, and her heart ached with the unbearable weight of it all. The funeral service had been long, and she had struggled to hold back tears. But now, in this quiet moment, she could no longer pretend that everything was okay. She wanted to hold on to him, to feel the warmth of his embrace one last time. But the reality was, that was no longer possible. The room seemed to disappear as she leaned down, her face hovering just above his still form. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, and she squeezed them shut, trying to hold them back. She had to be strong. For him, for the family, for everyone who was looking at her. In that moment, she wished for a miracle. She wished she could turn back time, even just for a few minutes, to relive one more memory with him, to hear him laugh again. She closed her eyes tighter, imagining his voice in her head. But as she did, a strange thing happened. Her heart was heavy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. As if, just for a moment, the world was standing still, waiting. Something inside her stirred, something deep within her soul. She couldn't explain it, but the connection she felt to her father in that instant was stronger than it had ever been before. It was as if the goodbye was not the end, but just the beginning of something she didn't yet understand. With a deep breath, she let the tears fall. She whispered to him, her voice cracking with emotion, "I love you, Dad. I'll always love you." She held on to that moment, unwilling to let it slip away. And in the stillness of the room, as the girl said her final farewell, she couldn't shake the feeling that something amazing was about to happen. But for now, she had no idea what it would be. The girl stood there, her hand still resting gently on the edge of the coffin, her heart aching. She couldn't tear herself away from the sight of her father lying so still, so lifeless. She had always imagined that the hardest part would be letting him go, but this was so much worse than she had ever expected. Her thoughts raced, memories flooding in as she looked at his face. Peaceful, calm. It didn't feel real. He wasn't supposed to look like this. He wasn't supposed to be cold and silent. Her eyes wandered around the room, taking in the faces of relatives, friends, and strangers who had gathered to say their goodbyes. They were all here, just like she was, but no one seemed to be able to find the right words to comfort her. Everyone wore masks of sorrow, eyes filled with grief and sympathy, but no one knew the depth of her pain. No one could understand how much this loss cut her to the bone. She had always been close to her father, their bond unbreakable. He was the one who taught her how to ride a bike, the one who took her fishing on weekends, the one who could always make her laugh when she needed it most. He had been her rock, her protector, and now he was gone. Just like that. She couldn't understand how the world could keep spinning when everything she knew had shattered into 1,000 pieces. A soft sob escaped her lips, and she quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her dress, trying to regain control. She didn't want anyone to see her like this. She had always been the strong one, the one who took care of everyone else. She had always been able to hold it together, but this was different. She felt so small and helpless in the face of such overwhelming grief. She looked at her father once more, her chest tightening with sorrow. His death didn't feel final. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that there was more to this than just a farewell. But what could it be? She wasn't sure, but deep down, she couldn't shake the sense that there was something important about this moment, something she couldn't yet understand. As the minutes passed, the girl began to feel the weight of the silence around her. The room felt colder, even though there was a warmth in the air. She noticed how the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the floor. It was as though time had slowed down, the world outside continuing on as normal, but here, in this room, everything stood still. She reached out again, this time brushing a stray lock of hair away from her father's forehead, her fingers lingering on his skin. She couldn't help herself. She just wanted to be close to him for as long as she could. She wanted to hold on, even if just for a few seconds more. It was too much to let go, too soon. She wasn't ready. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, but she didn't care anymore. She let them fall freely, not bothering to hide them. She whispered to him once more, her voice shaky, "I miss you so much, Dad. I don't know how to do this without you." The words were barely audible, but in the quiet room, they felt like a prayer, a desperate plea for him to come back, to somehow make everything right again. But nothing happened. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to hold on to the memory of his smile, the sound of his voice. She didn't know how much longer she could stand there, but she knew she had to. This was the last time she would ever be this close to him, and she wanted to remember every single moment of it. As she took a deep breath, she suddenly felt something she couldn't quite explain. A strange, comforting warmth seemed to fill the space around her, wrapping around her like a blanket. It wasn't just the warmth of the room. It was something else, something deeper. She opened her eyes, and for a brief moment, it felt as if her father's presence was still with her, as though he was there, right beside her, offering his love and comfort one last time. The girl stood still, her hands still resting on the edge of the coffin, the strange sensation continuing to linger. It was so subtle at first that she almost thought it was just her imagination. But no, it was real. There was a warmth beneath her fingertips, as though her father's body, cold as it had been moments ago, was somehow responding to her touch. She pulled her hand back, confused, her breath catching in her throat. She blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was she imagining things? Could grief really play tricks on the mind like this? She looked around the room, her heart racing. No one else seemed to notice anything unusual. The mourners were still gathered in their quiet, sorrowful huddles, lost in their own grief, unaware of the strange sensation she was feeling. But it was undeniable. The warmth was still there, faint but undeniable, as if something was pulsing under the surface. Her mind raced. She couldn't possibly be imagining this, could she? She gently placed her hand back on her father's chest, hesitating just for a moment before committing fully. The warmth seemed to increase, spreading gently through her fingers. It wasn't like the warmth of the sun or the comforting heat of a fire. No, this was something entirely different, almost as if her father's presence was still there, still reaching out to her. She couldn't explain it, but she knew what she felt. It was real. The air around her seemed to shift, and for the briefest moment, the room felt alive in a way it hadn't before. She felt an inexplicable connection to her father, as though his spirit was still in the room, surrounding her, offering her comfort. Her heart raced, her mind whirling with questions. Was this some kind of sign? Was this really happening? Her pulse quickened, and she leaned in closer, her eyes never leaving her father's still face. For a moment, she just stood there, lost in the sensation of warmth and love that seemed to surround her. Then something else happened, something even stranger. A small twitch, it was barely noticeable, but it was there. A movement that seemed to come from within her father's body. She gasped and stepped back in shock. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was she seeing things? Could it be? She watched, her breath held, as she waited for another sign, another movement. At first, there was nothing, just the steady quiet of the room. But then, there it was again. A twitch, a shift beneath the fabric of his clothing. It was so faint that she almost convinced herself it wasn't real. But she had felt it. She had seen it. Her father's body was responding to her in some way. Could this really be happening? Could it be that after all this time, after all the pain and loss, there was still a chance, just the smallest chance, that her father was still with her in some form? Her mind raced with possibilities. She wanted to believe it, wanted to reach out and hold on to the feeling of his presence, but she was also terrified. What did this mean? Was it some kind of trick, a product of her grief playing out in her mind? Or was there something more to this, something that she couldn't yet understand? As she stood there, her father's still body before her, she felt the warmth once more intense this time. Her fingers tingled where they made contact, as if the warmth was somehow moving through her, connecting them in a way that she couldn't describe. She closed her eyes and held her breath, trying to make sense of it all. Was this a dream? Or was it something far more profound than she could ever have imagined? The girl stood in complete silence, her hand still resting on her father's chest. Her breath was shallow, her heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and hope. What was happening? She had never experienced anything like this before, and it was so overwhelming. She wasn't sure how to react. She couldn't tear her eyes away from his face. The warmth that she had felt earlier was still there, and it was growing stronger. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was as though the very air around her was thick with energy, a presence she couldn't see but could deeply sense. Her mind was racing, filled with so many questions, so much doubt. What could this possibly mean? She glanced around the room again, expecting someone to notice what was happening, to interrupt this strange moment. But everyone was still wrapped up in their grief, their attention fixed on the ceremony that was taking place. No one seemed to notice the subtle, inexplicable change in the air around her. And so, she remained where she was, her fingers still pressing gently against her father's chest. The sensation continued to grow, and with it, a deep, comforting warmth filled her chest. She wasn't sure how to explain it, but she could feel something connecting her to her father, as if his spirit was reaching out to her, assuring her that he was still there, still present in some way. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that this wasn't just a figment of her imagination. Her father had always been her protector, the one who was always there when she needed him. Perhaps in some way, he was still watching over her. Then, as if in response to her thoughts, something more remarkable happened. It was so subtle that she wasn't sure if she was imagining it, but there was no denying the change. The tiniest of movements, so small that at first she thought it was nothing. But then it happened again. Her father's hand twitched. Just a slight, almost imperceptible motion that sent a shiver down her spine. Her heart skipped a beat as she leaned closer, her eyes wide with disbelief. Could it be? Was her father? Was he coming back to life? Her hands began to tremble, and her breath caught in her throat. She reached out, barely able to hold herself together, but the overwhelming urge to confirm what she was feeling made her continue. The twitching of his hand was now more definite, more purposeful. She could hardly believe it, but she knew what she was witnessing. This couldn't be a dream. It couldn't be her imagination. Her father was somehow responding to her touch. Her chest tightened with emotion. She wanted to scream, to shout for someone to come and see this miracle, but she was frozen, unable to make a sound. Her father's chest rose and fell ever so slightly, almost as if he was breathing, though so faintly that it was barely noticeable. She didn't know what to think. Was this real? Was this just a fleeting moment, a trick of her mind? Or was something truly miraculous taking place? The warmth surrounding her continued to grow, and she could feel her father's presence filling the space. Her mind was overwhelmed with emotions: grief, joy, confusion, hope. And yet, all she could do was stay there, holding her breath, waiting for whatever was about to happen. Every second felt like an eternity. She felt as if the entire world had come to a halt, and everything depended on this single moment. The girl could no longer hold back her tears. They spilled down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness alone. They were tears of awe, of disbelief, of wonder. She whispered his name softly, almost afraid that speaking too loudly would break the delicate magic of the moment. "Dad." Her voice cracked, but there was something in the air now, something different, something almost like a response. She held on to that feeling as the room around her seemed to pulse with life, waiting for the next sign, the next miracle. The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she stared down at her father, unable to move, her mind racing with disbelief. Was this really happening? She had expected the grief to be overwhelming, as it had been for the past days. But this was something else entirely. Something that felt both unreal and deeply, profoundly real. Her father's hand twitched again, a small movement that sent a ripple of shock through her entire body. Her breath caught in her throat as she leaned in closer, her hands shaking. Her father's skin, which had been cold and unyielding moments before, now felt warmer beneath her fingers, as though the pulse of life had returned to him. Her thoughts raced, questions flooding her mind. Could it be a sign of hope? Could he really be coming back? The warmth spreading from his chest seemed to grow, filling the space around her with a sense of familiarity. It was as if he were still there, still with her in some way. A part of her wanted to shout out, to tell someone, anyone, what was happening, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She was terrified that the moment would disappear if she disturbed it. She looked up once more, hoping to see someone else in the room react. But everyone was still lost in their own grief, their own thoughts, not aware of what was unfolding right before them. She felt so alone in that moment, though surrounded by family. No one else seemed to notice the miracle, the shift in the air that was growing stronger by the second. Tears welled up in her eyes as she leaned closer, pressing her hand firmly against her father's chest. It was as though he was still there, still alive within her, guiding her through this overwhelming moment. She whispered his name, almost afraid to believe what she was seeing and feeling. "Dad, please, if this is you, let me know." Her voice was barely a whisper, but she meant every word. The girl's emotions were in turmoil. She felt fear, disbelief, and a glimmer of hope that she hadn't felt since his death. Then, just as she thought the warmth might be fading, she felt it again. A soft movement, unmistakable. A breath. It was so faint, so delicate, that for a moment she thought it was just her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. But no, it wasn't. It was her father's chest, rising and falling ever so slightly, as if he was taking in a breath after being still for so long. Her heart skipped a beat, and she couldn't help the wave of joy that washed over her. She wanted to jump up and shout for joy, but she didn't. Instead, she stayed where she was, careful not to disrupt the fragile moment. She felt an overwhelming need to hold on to it, to savor it as though it was something fleeting, something fragile that might slip away if she wasn't careful. And yet, every second that passed felt more real, more miraculous. Could it be? Could this really be her father coming back? For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The sounds of the room, the low murmur of conversations, the distant shuffle of footsteps, all faded into the background. All that remained was her and her father, and the incredible, almost impossible sense that life was returning to him. She took another step forward, unable to tear her eyes away from his face. His features, once so still, and lifeless, now seemed softer, as if the tension that had held his face in a fixed, sorrowful expression had started to release. She placed her hand gently on his, her fingers trembling but firm, as if trying to hold on to this moment as tightly as possible. And then it happened again, a twitch, a tiny, deliberate movement, like a signal, a sign. This time, it wasn't just her imagination. It was real. He was moving. Her father was coming back. A flood of emotions rushed through her, relief, disbelief, joy, and fear all blending together into a single overwhelming feeling. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady herself, but her heart raced faster than ever before. Her father was alive. The miracle was unfolding before her eyes. The girl stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her father's hand had twitched again, more noticeably this time. Her heart raced, the sound of it pounding in her ears. She could hardly believe it. He was really moving. He was alive. She reached out cautiously, her hand trembling as she hovered above his chest. Her fingers brushed against him again, and she felt the faintest rise and fall of his breath. It was so light, so delicate, that she almost wondered if she was imagining it. But no, this was real. She could feel it. Tears welled up in her eyes, a mixture of confusion, relief, and awe flooding her heart. She wanted to shout for joy, but instead, she remained silent, afraid that if she spoke, the moment might disappear. She leaned closer, holding her breath, watching for any further movement. And then, just as she was about to pull back, it happened. His chest rose again, just slightly, a faint but unmistakable breath that sent a rush of warmth through her. Her heart soared. Her father was breathing. He was coming back to life. But even as joy surged through her, a twinge of fear followed close behind. Was this real? Could this really be happening? She looked around the room again, hoping to find someone who would confirm what she was experiencing. But no one else seemed to notice. The room remained as it had been before, quiet, filled with mourners, each lost in their own thoughts of grief. No one was watching. No one saw the miracle unfolding right before her eyes. She looked back down at her father, his face now slightly more animated, though still pale and still. His hand, which had twitched once more, now seemed to rest more comfortably in hers. It was a small change, but it was enough to send waves of relief crashing through her. He wasn't just moving. He was slowly coming back. It was like witnessing a miracle, a slow, impossible miracle. But as she watched him, her mind was filled with questions. What did this mean? Why was this happening? And most importantly, how? She had to know more. She had to be sure. She looked around the room once more, and this time her gaze caught the eyes of the funeral attendants who had been standing at the far side of the room, watching quietly. They, too, seemed to notice the change, though they didn't approach her right away. She could see the confusion in their eyes as they exchanged glances. They were waiting for confirmation, just like she was. For a few long moments, no one moved. It was as though time had paused, holding its breath along with her. Then, the girl whispered her father's name softly, barely able to speak. "Dad, can you hear me?" She waited, her pulse quickening with anticipation. And then, before she could even process it, his lips moved. It was almost imperceptible at first, but there was no mistaking it. He had spoken. His voice was weak, but it was there. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but unmistakably his. The girl's breath caught in her throat. It was him. It was really him. Her father had come back. A flood of emotion overwhelmed her, and she didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or just hold on tight to the moment, and never let go. She wanted to scream for joy, to shout out for everyone to hear, but she couldn't find the words. She simply stood there, holding his hand, feeling the warmth spreading between them like a thread that connected them through space and time. The paramedics, who had been quietly observing, finally made their way to her, moving with cautious steps. They were still unsure of what was happening, but they could see the changes too. They weren't sure whether to celebrate or call it a miracle, but they were certain of one thing. Something extraordinary was taking place. The girl didn't know what to do next. She had always imagined this moment, but never in her wildest dreams had she expected something like this. She looked down at her father, his eyes fluttering open for the first time. He was breathing now, and with every breath, the impossible seemed to become more real. But what now? What would happen next? She had no answers, only the overwhelming certainty that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the soft sounds of the girl's breathing as she stood beside her father. He was still unconscious, yet there was no denying the changes that had begun to take place. His chest rose and fell gently, and his hands were no longer stiff and cold but warm, almost lifelike. The miracle she had longed for was unfolding before her eyes, but the uncertainty was still there. What did this mean? Was he truly coming back to her? The paramedics, who had been standing by in shock, finally approached her cautiously. They exchanged glances, unsure of what they were witnessing, but seeing the undeniable signs of life. One of them stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her father's wrist, feeling for a pulse. The girl barely dared to breathe, her eyes locked on the paramedic's face. The tension in the air was thick as everyone waited for the verdict. It's real," the paramedic said, his voice soft with disbelief. "There's a pulse. It's weak, but it's there." The girl's heart soared with hope, but she didn't allow herself to get too excited just yet. There were still so many unknowns. Her father had been gone for so long. Could he truly come back from this? She tried to focus on the present moment, on the warmth of his hand in hers, on the life she could feel returning to him. But the uncertainty gnawed at her. The paramedics moved quickly, preparing equipment, calling for an ambulance to take them to the hospital. The girl, however, couldn't bring herself to leave his side. She stayed close, holding his hand, as if that connection was the only thing grounding her in reality. Every moment felt like an eternity as they moved her father, carefully lifting him onto a stretcher. She walked alongside them, her eyes never leaving his face, praying that this was real, that he wouldn't slip away again. Once they reached the ambulance, the door shut behind her, and the vehicle sped off to the hospital. The girl sat beside her father, her heart racing with fear and hope, her mind racing with questions. How was this possible? What had brought him back? Was it some kind of miracle, or was there a scientific explanation she couldn't comprehend? As the ambulance raced down the street, the girl's thoughts shifted back to her father. She had spent so much time grieving, so much time thinking he was gone forever. Now she was filled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. If her father had truly come back, what did that mean for her? What did it mean for their future together? The hospital was only a few miles away, but it felt like it took forever to get there. Every second that passed seemed more unreal than the last. She couldn't stop herself from looking at him, watching for any sign that he would wake up, that this miracle might continue. Her fingers brushed over his hand, trying to comfort him, as if her touch could anchor him to the world. When they finally arrived at the hospital, a flurry of activity surrounded them as the medical staff took over. The girl was ushered into the waiting room, her father being rushed into the emergency room. She couldn't bear to leave him, but she was forced to wait. The uncertainty was overwhelming, the fear of losing him all over again threatening to drown her. Time seemed to stand still as she sat in the waiting room, her thoughts swirling. What was happening to her father? Was he going to survive this? Was he going to wake up and be the same person he was before? She didn't know, but she was determined to hold on to the hope that had returned with him. The possibility of having him back, of getting another chance with him, was more than she could ever have imagined. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor came in. His face was serious but soft, his eyes filled with an understanding she couldn't quite place. He spoke gently, as if trying to calm her fears, but she could see the amazement in his eyes. "He's stable," the doctor said. "He's still unconscious, but we got him hooked up to everything we need. It's too soon to say what's going to happen next, but this is nothing short of remarkable." The girl felt her chest tighten, and for the first time in what felt like days, she let herself relax just a little. Her father was still here. He was still fighting, and that was all that mattered. As she sank into the chair, feeling the weight of the moment, she knew that this was only the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, but her father was alive, and that was all that mattered. The girl sat in the hospital waiting room, her heart still racing with the rush of emotions that had overwhelmed her earlier. She had been in there for what felt like hours, but time had become irrelevant. All that mattered was the fact that her father was still alive, that he was still fighting to come back to her. The uncertainty and fear were still there, but they had been replaced with a fragile hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. She couldn't stop thinking about the moment when she had first felt his warmth, the first sign that he was returning to life. She clung to that memory as if it were a lifeline. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a nurse walked into the waiting room. Her face was calm, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, a mixture of relief and surprise. The girl's breath caught in her throat as she stood up, her mind already racing with questions. "He's awake," the nurse said, her voice soft but steady. "Your father is awake. He's confused, but he's asking for you." The girl could hardly believe what she was hearing. She felt the blood rush to her head as she grabbed her things and followed the nurse down the hallway. Her steps were quick, almost frantic, as she approached her father's room. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. What would he be like? Would he remember everything? Would he be the same? When the nurse opened the door, she stepped into the room slowly, almost as if she didn't want to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over them. Her father lay there in the bed, his eyes blinking as though he was trying to adjust to the light. He looked pale and weak, but there was life in his eyes, life that hadn't been there just a few hours ago. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with confusion and wonder. For a moment, they just stared at each other, neither of them knowing what to say. Then, with a hoarse voice, he whispered, You're here." The girl's chest tightened, and she walked to his side, her hands trembling as she took his hand in hers. The warmth of his skin was real, not a figment of her imagination. He was here. He was alive. And he was asking for her. "I'm here, Dad," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I never left you." He smiled faintly, his eyes still filled with uncertainty, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. I thought I was gone. How is this possible?" The girl shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know. I don't care. All that matters is that you're here. You're with me." Her father squeezed her hand weakly, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what happened. I don't remember much, but I feel different, like something changed." The girl nodded, brushing the hair from his forehead, as she smiled through her tears. "You came back to us, Dad. You came back." They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had gone through hanging in the air between them. The girl couldn't stop staring at him, as though making sure that this was real, that this wasn't just some dream or illusion. He was alive. He was there with her. Finally, her father spoke again, his voice stronger now. "I don't know how I came back, but I know I have you to thank for it. I felt you, even when I couldn't reach you. Your love, it brought me back." The girl smiled softly, her heart swelling with emotion. "It wasn't just me, Dad. It was you, too. You never gave up. I could feel you there with me. I knew you were still fighting." Her father's gaze softened, and for a moment, it was as though they were the only two people in the world. The girl knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be many questions left unanswered. But for now, all she cared about was that they had this moment. Her father had returned, and together, they would face whatever came next. The world outside the hospital room seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, reunited in a way that neither of them had ever imagined possible. They had both endured so much, but in that moment, they had everything they needed, each other. And that, the girl realized, was all that truly mattered.